In Elizabethan England, most people believed that society depended on order. The idea that everyone had a proper place was widely accepted, yet there was growing anxiety about what happened when that order seemed unstable. Writers of the time often warned that disorder could lead to chaos, and many feared that people were no longer respecting the roles assigned to them. While agreement existed about the importance of hierarchy, there was far less certainty about how that hierarchy actually worked or where individuals truly belonged within it. Traditionally, social position was understood as something fixed, shaped by birth and duty. Over time, however, wealth and property began to matter as much as lineage. Farmers, traders, and merchants were becoming richer, and their growing influence made the old structure harder to maintain. As a result, the social system looked far more rigid on paper than it did in daily life. The belief that social rank also reflected moral worth only increased tension, since behavior did not always match expectations. The edges between ranks were often unclear, and people frequently argued, negotiated, or quietly tested those boundaries. Hierarchy was not simply accepted, it was lived, displayed, and sometimes challenged. Although social order was imagined as simple, it was built from several overlapping layers. Political authority, religious standing, economic power, and family roles were all expected to reinforce one another. Kings ruled subjects, clergy guided laypeople, masters commanded servants, and husbands led wives. Each role came with obligations, and each depended on the others. Yet these relationships were not as straightforward as they appeared. A man who held authority in his household was still subject to the crown. A woman might be subordinate as a wife, but hold power as a widow or employer. For Elizabethans, separating public life from private life was not always meaningful. Authority flowed across both. Writers who tried to describe English society usually divided people into broad groups. At the top stood the nobility and gentry, followed by town citizens, prosperous farmers, and finally, the laboring population. Those at the highest level were themselves ranked, from great lords down to lesser gentlemen. Titles, ancestry, and royal favor mattered, but not all status was inherited. Knighthood, for example, was earned rather than passed down, and certain honors were limited to a small number of individuals. These distinctions were often justified by pointing to ancient traditions or foreign examples, reinforcing the idea that hierarchy was natural and universal. The category of gentleman caused particular unease. Being a gentleman was not solely about bloodline, it was also about lifestyle. Education, wealth, leisure, and public appearance all played a role. A man who did not work with his hands, who dressed and behaved appropriately, and who could afford a certain standard of living might be treated as a gentleman regardless of his origins. Official recognition, such as a coat of arms, was supposed to confirm status, but even these symbols could be acquired through influence or money. This flexibility allowed people to rise socially, but it also created confusion and resentment. Respect was no longer automatically guaranteed, and people often disagreed about who deserved it. Below the gentry were the townsmen who held civic rights. These individuals could vote in local matters and serve in office. Among them, merchants stood out. They played a key role in expanding trade and connecting England to distant markets, but they were also blamed for rising prices and shortages at home. Their wealth allowed them to move upward socially, sometimes trading places with the gentry themselves. This exchange further blurred the old divisions. Prosperous farmers formed another important group. They owned land, worked hard, and often lived comfortably. Though not considered gentlemen, they were respected for their stability and contribution to local life. Many invested in their children's education, enabling the next generation to move into higher social ranks. These farmers were seen as disciplined, practical, and reliable, and they played an important role in both the economy and local government. At the base of society were laborers, artisans, and servants. This group made up the majority of the population, but was rarely discussed in detail. They were expected to obey rather than lead, to work rather than govern. Moral judgment often shaped how they were described, especially when they were seen as idle or disorderly. Their exclusion from political influence reflected how tightly authority was guarded. Ideas about hierarchy extended into the household. Family life was viewed as the foundation of social order. A well-governed home was believed to produce loyal subjects and obedient citizens. Authority flowed from God to ruler, from ruler to household head, and from household head to dependents. This chain of command reinforced the idea that hierarchy was essential at every level of life. Hierarchy was not only an idea, it was something people could see. Everyday gestures such as bowing, removing a hat, or choosing the correct form of address signaled relative status. Titles mattered, but so did subtle differences in speech and behavior. Public ceremonies made hierarchy unmistakable. Coronations, royal processions, and official gatherings placed individuals in carefully arranged positions, reminding everyone of their rank. The royal court offered the most dramatic display. Every movement of the monarch was surrounded by ritual. Who walked closest, who spoke, who stood, and who knelt all conveyed power and privilege. These performances were not accidental. They were carefully designed to make authority visible and unquestionable. Cities and towns had their own versions of these displays. Civic processions celebrated local government, wealth, and loyalty to the crown. In major cities, such events grew increasingly elaborate, filled with symbolism, spectacle, and public feasting. Even smaller towns used festivals and communal celebrations to reinforce leadership and unity. Church was another space where hierarchy became visible. Seating arrangements reflected social distinctions. Men and women were separated, servants were placed apart, and individuals were ranked by a mix of wealth, reputation, age, and behavior. These decisions were not always simple and often caused disputes. A person's moral conduct could affect where they sat, showing that status came with expectations. Authority was not permanent. It could be lost. Clothing also played a powerful role. Laws attempted to regulate who could wear certain fabrics, colors, and decorations. Luxury materials were reserved for those of high rank or significant income. Yet these rules were filled with exceptions. Wealth, office, and service to the crown could all grant permission to display status visually. Repeated attempts to enforce clothing laws suggest that people regularly ignored them. The desire to look important was strong, and the boundaries were difficult to police. When you read old writings about hierarchy in Elizabethan England, everything looks tidy and predictable. On paper, people seem to fit into clear categories, and respect appears automatic. But the moment hierarchy had to be lived in real spaces, it became messy. Everyday life exposed the weak points. Most of the time, people did not openly fight the system, yet the moments when they did push back reveal how the system truly operated. Those disputes show where society felt pressure, how status was argued over, and who had the power to decide what rank looked like in public. One easy example was clothing. Rules existed about who could wear certain fabrics and styles, but many ignored them. People dressed above their station anyway, sometimes even ruining themselves financially just to look important. Observers noticed how common it was to see expensive street clothing on people who could barely afford to eat properly at home. That gap between what was expected and what people actually did mattered, because it shows how strong the desire for visible status could be and how difficult it was to control it. A bigger and more constant source of conflict appeared in churches. Sunday worship was not only religious, it was one of the main public stages where local hierarchy was displayed. Where you sat signaled who you were. That made seating a serious matter, and it caused arguments again and again. These disputes were rarely about whether hierarchy should exist. They were usually about placement, who deserved a better seat, who had been wronged, and whose claim carried more weight. Some villages struggled because there simply were not enough good seats for the people who felt entitled to them. When several wealthy households lived in the same parish, it was no longer simple to keep everyone satisfied. Old families believed long presence in the community should earn them honor. Newer families argued that property and household size demanded recognition. Church space did not expand fast enough to match population growth, and the pressure turned seating into a battlefield of symbols. Local communities often tried to balance past and present, tradition and money, reputation and power. Even when a seat was connected to a house, people still judged the worth of the family inside it. A name rooted in the village for generations could carry weight that a newcomer could not easily buy, even if the newcomer owned the grandest home. Disputes did not happen only among the very rich. People lower down also fought over seating because church arrangements were one of the few public measurements of rank available to ordinary householders. Sometimes a person claimed a place that others thought belonged to a different gender section or a different level of status. Sometimes a man objected to being displaced by someone viewed as poorer or less respectable. In these arguments, witnesses often described one person as solid, established, and well-regarded, while dismissing the other as insignificant, unstable, or socially beneath him. The words people used mattered because reputation was not just pride. It had real consequences. In a world where money was often scarce, trust and standing could determine whether you got credit, whether neighbors helped you, and how officials treated you. Church authorities, especially church wardens, were deeply involved in these decisions, and that power created resentment. When they moved someone to a worse seat, it felt like public humiliation. The reasons could vary. Wealth might matter, but so could property arrangements, household independence, moral behavior, or the way someone contributed to the community. A person who gave money to poor relief might feel insulted if moved to a place associated with poverty. Others might argue that if a family was living as lodgers rather than independent householders, they should not sit among people considered their superiors. These disagreements showed that status was judged by many competing standards, not one clear rule. Sometimes the conflict went beyond seating and became a direct refusal to show respect. Early modern communities were highly sensitive to insults because a public slight could damage a person's standing. Courts were filled with quarrels where people sued over defamation, and what made many insults worse was the idea that they came from someone supposedly inferior. When a common person spoke harshly to a gentleman, or when someone shouted abuse at a minister, it was treated as more than rude language. It was seen as an attack on the local order itself, because it questioned who was allowed to speak to whom in certain ways. Occasionally, people crossed an even sharper line by claiming equality with someone above them. Instead of simply insulting a superior, they declared they were just as good as him. That kind of statement mattered because it directly challenged the assumption that rank demanded automatic deference. Even when such claims were rare, they show that not everyone accepted the social system as fully as the official ideal suggested. Clergy were often at the center of these tensions because their position was complicated. They were expected to receive respect like gentlemen, yet their livelihood could depend on collecting dues from the same parishioners they were meant to guide. That dependence created friction. Parishioners sometimes mocked ministers, doubting their authority, ridiculing their character, or questioning their learning. Ministers, on the other hand, could grow bitter when trying to collect what they believed was owed to them, especially when dealing with wealthier parishioners who had land and influence. The struggle was not only financial, it was also about dignity. A minister might feel entitled to respect, but lack the wealth to live like a gentleman. A local gentleman might feel irritated at being morally lectured by someone he considered socially weak. The result was a constant push and pull that surfaced in insults, confrontations, and legal actions. Economic and demographic change intensified these struggles. A growing population increased demand for food and goods, pushing prices upward. Those who supplied that demand often grew richer, especially prosperous farmers and merchants, and their rising wealth pressured older expectations about birth and rank. Yet because the hierarchy was not perfectly fixed, society could absorb many of these shifts. People could climb, fall, and compete while still speaking the language of order. So even when tensions flared, most conflicts stayed focused on position within the system rather than rejection of the system. Hierarchy remained the public ideal, but in practice it was a moving target, argued over in daily life, and constantly reshaped by wealth, behavior, reputation, and local power. In 16th century England, the country could not be governed from London alone. The crown needed powerful partners on the ground, and those partners were the nobility and the wider gentry. Their cooperation with the monarch was one of the main reasons order held together, laws were enforced, and royal authority reached into every county. For a long time, older historical writing did not pay enough attention to how essential these groups were. More recent research has treated them with greater care, showing that Tudor government was not just a royal machine, but a system built through relationships, service, and local power. Even so, the titled nobility were a tiny group compared with the rest of society. At the start of Elizabeth's reign, the number of peers with major titles was very small. Titles could pass down through inheritance, but they could also be granted by the monarch as a reward for loyalty and service. Elizabeth was careful about creating new peers, which kept the noble ranks from growing quickly. At one point, England had only a single duke, and after his execution, the highest titles left were below that level. Beneath the titled elite stood the gentry, a much larger and more varied world, stretching from younger sons of noble houses to country landowners and ambitious men rising from towns, some of whom would have counted as nobles in other parts of Europe. People in Elizabeth's England argued constantly about what made someone truly gentle or noble. Advice books on manners and elite behavior became popular, offering models of how the upper ranks should speak, dress, and act. In theory, noble status was something you were born into. In reality, it could be disrupted and reshaped. Family lines sometimes ended, titles were sometimes stripped away, and new titles were sometimes created. Over time, Many noble labels disappeared because there was no surviving heir, which meant the noble world was less ancient and stable than it pretended to be. Those who rose quickly often tried to build an impressive past as soon as they gained a title. Wealthy new families paid for genealogies that pushed their origins deep into history, even when those stories were doubtful. Heralds and official institutions could be persuaded to support these claims, especially when money and influence were involved. Not everyone was fooled. Some observers mocked the way ambitious men bought symbols and invented ancestral glory. Yet in most cases, the story did its job. It smoothed over uncomfortable questions about whether birth alone defined nobility. By the end of the century, another idea was also gaining ground: that personal merit, education, and virtue could be used to justify high status. The more society changed, the more people searched for explanations that matched the world they were actually seeing. The gentry were even harder to pin down. They included different grades, but the boundary between them and everyone below was often based on recognition rather than a single official rule. A man counted as gentry if he lived like one, presented himself as one, held local responsibilities, and was treated as such by others around him. Land remained important, but it was no longer the only doorway. Educated professions increasingly fitted into gentry culture. Clergymen, lawyers, government servants, and university-trained men could be treated as gentlemen if they had the income and lifestyle to match the role. In other words, social status could follow learning and wealth as much as ancestry. During the 16th century, the size of the gentry grew quickly. This matched the growth of Tudor administration, especially after major land changes earlier in the century opened new opportunities for purchase and advancement. As government expanded, so did the number of people involved in running it locally. The result was a society where the group that handled local authority became larger and more competitive. Later, historians argued fiercely about what this meant. Some believed that a rising gentry were taking power and influence away from the old nobility, pushing England toward future conflict. Others challenged the idea that the nobles were collapsing or that the gentry were marching upward in a straight line. Over time, broad theories lost popularity, and historians began to focus more on the details: what happened inside court politics, how counties were governed, how patronage worked, and how networks of family and favor linked villages to the center of power. That shift made one point clearer. Nobles and gentry were not always natural enemies. Often they shared interests, worked together, and were bound to the monarchy by mutual dependence. In local government, gentry families were everywhere. They served as magistrates, deputies, sheriffs, and members of parliament. These jobs paid no salary, demanded time, and could cost money, yet men competed for them. The reason is simple. Office was a public badge of importance. It confirmed status, strengthened alliances, created leverage in local disputes, and gave a man a stronger voice when seeking rewards from the crown. For many office holders, there was also a genuine belief that they had a duty to serve their monarch and community. Whether motivated by ambition, conscience, or both, they formed the backbone of county administration. The central government tried to shape who held these posts, but it could not fully control the counties. When a powerful local gentleman was removed, he might return quickly, because officials in London still needed his influence, experience, and ability to make things happen. This reveals a hard truth about Tudor rule. The crown depended on cooperation. It could pressure local leaders, but it often could not govern effectively without them. Across England, The relationship between center and locality worked both ways. Local elites wanted court connections, favors, and advancement beyond their county. Court figures needed support in the shires to build power, secure loyalty, and manage national demands like taxes, musters, and religious enforcement. Patronage networks and family alliances acted like a bridge, carrying local requests toward the center and bringing royal authority back down into everyday administration. A local gentleman might write to a major minister to protect a neighbor or soften a legal problem, and such messages show how personal and relational government could be. At the heart of government, the top councils were dominated by great lords and leading figures, especially early in Elizabeth's reign. Over time, as older nobles died and vacancies were not always filled quickly, the composition changed. By the later years, being high-born and wealthy was not enough on its own. Loyalty, long service, and the monarch's trust mattered more. Still, this was not a system that opened the doors to ordinary men. Power remained concentrated among a narrow circle, often tied together by blood, service, and shared interests. Certain families became especially influential because they held the queen's confidence and mastered the machinery of administration. Royal favor was the oxygen of this world. A great career could rise on access to the monarch and collapse when that access vanished. Some men found themselves pushed away from court for personal scandals or political missteps, and their influence faded fast. Others, admired by many, never fully gained the queen's trust, and therefore never reached the heights their supporters expected. This dependence on favor was not a side detail. It shaped the entire political landscape. In some regions, earlier Tudor policies had already weakened the old magnate houses. In the north, several great families lost ground as the crown placed trusted outsiders and loyal local figures into key positions. Over time, exclusion created bitterness, and rebellion was one consequence. The decline of major northern houses did not automatically bring peace. Instead, it often left a vacuum that had to be managed by carefully selected royal servants. Even so, it would be wrong to imagine a simple story in which nobles disappeared and gentry took over everywhere. In many counties, the gentry only rose into dominant roles when the leading noble family was weakened, absent, or removed. Where a great lord remained strong, his presence could keep local politics steadier by acting as a central patron and referee. When that stabilizing figure vanished, rivalry could explode. One county showed this problem clearly. After the fall of a powerful noble, local government became a struggle among competing gentry groups. Without a dominant patron to keep order, ambitious men fought for influence, allies, and access to the court. Some tried to act like the missing noble, claiming superior authority, and their rivals resisted fiercely. The result could be public quarrels, bitter lawsuits, and even violence, all playing out alongside official county business. Elsewhere, the same kind of noble fall produced less turmoil because county society had stronger habits of cooperation and a broader base of influential families. Where multiple powerful gentry networks already existed and where leaders valued local unity, conflict was contained. Even when tempers rose, respected figures pushed for compromise, warning that private disputes should not damage the county's reputation for harmony. What emerges from all this is a picture of Tudor government as a partnership. The monarchy needed nobles and gentry to maintain stability and enforce policy. Nobles and gentry needed royal support to strengthen their authority and reward their service. The system worked because it was flexible, personal, and deeply tied to networks of loyalty and influence. It could produce impressive stability, but it could also fracture when trust broke down, when patronage shifted, or when the balance of power in a county was suddenly removed. In many parts of England, local life stayed calmer when one great family clearly sat at the top. Where their authority was widely accepted, county politics had a natural center of gravity. Powerful households could connect lesser gentry to influence, settle disputes before they turned dangerous, and turn rivalry into cooperation by rewarding loyalty. In the Northwest, for example, the leading earls of the region held their position not only because they owned land, but because they controlled the web of relationships that mattered most. Families who aligned themselves with that dominant house could expect practical advantages, such as help in gaining office, protection in conflicts, and a stronger voice at court. Yet it was more than a bargain for profit. Many people simply believed this was how society was meant to function, with a great lord as the visible anchor of order. Public ceremony made that structure feel real. A major noble funeral could become a moving display of hierarchy, with every group placed carefully to show rank and loyalty. The procession might begin with the lord's personal gentlemen, then mounted knights and esquires, then key household officers, and finally a broad mass of servants and prosperous farmers. Close to the coffin and the heir would ride men from the leading gentry families, a clear signal that the old bonds continued and that the new head of the house still commanded respect. These rituals did not just honor the dead. They reminded everyone who mattered, who followed whom, and which families were expected to hold the chief offices in the shire. Not every branch of the elite kept its footing in Elizabeth's reign. The group that steadily lost influence was the Catholic nobility and gentry. From early on, the government treated religious conformity as a basic requirement for service. Officials began gathering reports on local magistrates and gentlemen, sorting them into those who supported the Protestant settlement, those who stood aside, and those who resisted it. Even so, removing Catholics from county leadership could not be done overnight, because some counties lacked enough experienced Protestant officials to replace them. In places where Catholic lords were dominant, the crown sometimes relied on them at first, then shifted away when political danger grew or loyalty seemed uncertain. As the years passed, religion became a sharper test. Plans connected to Mary, Queen of Scots, and later open unrest in the north, convinced the regime that private belief could become public threat. After that, service and reward increasingly followed outward conformity. Catholics who stayed loyal still found doors closing. Major offices went to Protestants, and trusted positions were handed to men whose religious alignment reassured the court. Even when a Catholic landowner had a long record of obedience, the climate of suspicion made continued promotion difficult. Pressure increased again when the Pope declared Elizabeth's rule illegitimate and encouraged Catholics to withdraw loyalty from her government. After that point, the state treated refusal to attend Protestant worship as both a religious and political issue. Heavy fines were imposed on those who stayed away, and for some families the financial damage was severe. Years of payments could swallow whole incomes, pushing landowners into debt and weakening the economic base that normally supported their local authority. At the same time, Catholics were blocked from the very offices that might have helped them recover. Laws and orders targeted recusants for removal from key local posts. New tests of loyalty were applied to magistrates, forcing anyone who refused to comply to step aside. Over the decades, this steadily changed the composition of county leadership. reducing Catholic presence among the families who held the most significant responsibilities. When war fears rose, especially during conflict with Spain, the government grew even less willing to rely on Catholic commanders and officials. Even prominent Catholic lords who had once held military responsibilities found themselves quietly edged out. This situation forced loyal Catholics to prove themselves in other ways. Military readiness became one of the few public languages they could still use to demonstrate commitment to the realm. Some stressed that their tenants could supply men for service if called upon. In moments of national danger, the crown also summoned nobles to gather in defense of the queen, creating a powerful stage for loyalty. Accounts from the time describe Catholic lords arriving despite age and illness, publicly declaring their willingness to risk their lives, families, and property against any invader. Such scenes served two purposes at once. They reassured the regime, and they gave Catholic elites a way to hold on to a core part of their identity as leaders obliged to protect the country. Because England did not have a permanent professional army, national security depended heavily on elite leadership. Nobles and leading gentry raised men, organized local forces, and commanded expeditions abroad. Major figures led campaigns in France, the Netherlands, and Ireland, while also maintaining order at home. Over the century, warfare changed. Guns and artillery increased costs, and the old model of a lord equipping large numbers of personal followers became harder to sustain, except for the wealthiest. The crown also tightened control over private retainers. Meanwhile, government expanded other methods of raising troops, especially through county levies and militia organization. Offices connected to local military command became more established over time, though they were often treated as honors rather than jobs with financial reward. Even with these shifts, it was still widely believed that only gentlemen could effectively lead ordinary people into war. Local commanders understood that social authority mattered as much as tactics. A captain from a respected family could draw out men and money in a way that outsiders could not. So while the state strengthened its administrative tools, it continued to rely on elite status to make those tools work in practice. The culture of service ran deep in the ruling classes. Gentry and nobles were repeatedly reminded that their responsibilities extended beyond their own estates. Officials urged them to see local office as a duty owed to God, monarch, and community. Education and literacy helped spread these ideals, but the values were older than the Tudor age. The elite still imagined itself as a warrior order with special obligations: loyalty, honor, discipline, fellowship, and protection of the common good. That self-image was reinforced through ritual and entertainment. Tournaments, tilts, and courtly displays remained popular because they kept the language of chivalry alive. The elite also consumed stories that celebrated courage and virtue. Epic romances, poems, and courtly literature offered models of behavior and ideals to copy. Many writers openly argued that literature should entertain while pushing readers toward better conduct, shaping character through example and admiration. Certain figures became symbols of the perfect gentleman. A celebrated courtier soldier who fought abroad and died from his wounds could be transformed into a national icon. His death would be framed as proof of courage, loyalty, faith, and care for country. Public mourning and written tributes turned his life into a lesson. This is what honor looks like. This is how service should be lived. And this is what the elite claims to stand for. Yet this culture also had a hard edge. Membership in the community of honor depended on loyalty to the monarch. When an elite figure crossed the line into treason, The punishment was not only death or imprisonment, but symbolic expulsion. Titles and honors could be stripped away publicly, as if the person had been erased from the moral world of the ruling class. By Elizabeth's reign, open rebellion by nobles was unusual, and when it happened, rebels often tried to justify themselves by claiming they opposed bad advisors rather than the queen herself. Even in revolt, they often used the language of obedience, trying to present their actions as a forced correction rather than a challenge to monarchy. The most serious noble rising of the reign came from the northern earls. It carried religious undertones and was linked to wider plots involving Mary, Queen of Scots. Yet it also followed an older pattern. Powerful regional lords felt excluded from offices and influence they believed were theirs by right, and they feared being crushed by a court they no longer trusted. They hesitated, argued among themselves, and repeatedly insisted they were loyal, even as events pushed them into open defiance. When the movement failed to gain strong popular energy and money ran short, the threat faded. Royal forces drove the rebels into flight, and the regime responded with severe punishment. The brutality of the aftermath was meant to send a message that such challenges, especially when mixed with religious danger, would be treated as a direct threat to the state. By contrast, a later upheaval led by a famous noble favorite looked less like a genuine attempt to overturn the crown and more like a desperate attempt to regain access and influence. The state still called it rebellion, but the scale of punishment was much smaller. The difference in outcomes shows what the regime feared most. Not mere protest, but any movement that might pull the realm into a wider crisis of loyalty, religion, and authority. In Elizabethan politics, everything began with one prize: getting close to the queen. Access was not a luxury or a social extra, it was the fuel of power. Elizabeth was not a distant figure who simply signed papers placed in front of her. She listened, questioned, judged, and chose. Decisions were shaped around her personality, her trust, and her sense of who deserved attention. That is why the court, and the city that surrounded it, became the main arena where politics truly happened. For most of the gentry, meeting the queen face to face was rare. They might serve their county faithfully for years and still never speak to her directly. Yet the court did not remain fixed in London at all times. Practical realities pushed it to move. Summers brought travel, partly because London could be unhealthy, and partly because a mobile court made it possible for the monarch to be seen beyond the capital. These journeys carried the queen across the country in carefully planned stages, stopping at major estates where government business could still continue, just in a different location. The people most likely to host her were not random choices. They were usually her trusted advisors and long-standing allies, many of them at the heart of her council. In that sense, the royal journey was not a holiday. It was government on the move. When the queen arrived at an estate, the visit turned into a public test. The host had to prove wealth, control, and refinement through hospitality on a grand scale. Feeding and housing the royal household was expensive, but the expense itself could become a statement. A successful visit showed everyone nearby that this family stood at the center of local authority and had the means to treat the queen as she should be treated. Over time, this pressure helped drive a new style of country mansion, designed not only for comfort, but for spectacle. Great houses rose with wide facades, formal gardens, impressive halls, and rooms meant to impress a royal guest. Some ministers and favorites poured fortunes into building projects, hoping the Queen's presence would validate their status and bring lasting advantage. Sometimes, hosting the Queen was treated as a visible sign of approval, almost like a public embrace. A visit could signal that a man had regained trust after a period of uncertainty, or that his service was being openly recognized. For courtiers whose careers depended on royal attention, a royal stopover could feel like a peak moment. Yet these visits could also become a burden. Hospitality demanded huge spending, and the rewards were not guaranteed. As Elizabeth grew older, some hosts began to calculate the cost more coldly. A royal visit might ruin a household's finances without bringing the offices, lands, or long-term favor that people expected. Late in the reign, a few men even tried to avoid the honor, claiming poverty and quietly revealing disappointment that promises of reward had not been fulfilled. Royal journeys also carried messages. Where the Queen went and whom she chose to honor could reassure or warn whole regions. After the crisis of the Armada, for example, the Crown had reasons to emphasize unity and loyalty. In one summer tour, Elizabeth visited an unusually high number of households linked to Catholic circles. That was not accidental. It was a political signal that obedience could still be recognized, even among families whose beliefs made the regime uneasy. In one famous case, a loyal Catholic lord welcomed her for several days and surrounded the visit with carefully staged declarations of devotion. Symbols of county leadership were displayed in dramatic fashion, as if to say, "These are the men of this region, and they stand ready to protect their sovereign with everything they have." The performances mattered because they turned loyalty into a public spectacle, binding host, neighbors, and monarch into the same story of service. Looking at the bigger picture, England's ruling class in Elizabeth's time had a distinctive character compared with many parts of Europe. The upper ranks in England were relatively unified in culture and expectations, and their interests often aligned with the monarchy rather than colliding against it. Elizabeth also cultivated unusually personal relationships with leading families, mixing political dependence with carefully managed intimacy. In some neighboring kingdoms, great noble houses were more openly ambitious, more independent, and sometimes more dangerous to the crown. In those places, monarchs were pushed to distance themselves from powerful aristocrats and to use a more deliberate system of state-controlled honors to keep them in line. Elsewhere in the British Isles, the situation looked different again. Wales was drawn into Tudor structures with some success, though local identity remained strong. Ireland presented the hardest challenge. English rulers could not simply ignore the great Irish magnates because governing the island required cooperation with them. Yet those same magnates often held power in ways that resisted English reforms and English expectations. Tudor policy tried to balance restraint with partnership, attempting to channel noble authority rather than smash it outright. Over time, tensions deepened. Efforts to reshape Irish local government, combined with harsh methods used by some officials, pushed many elites into alienation. The result was a long, grinding conflict that turned into major rebellion and war, showing what could happen when the bond between crown and nobility failed. That contrast throws England into sharper focus. In England, cooperation was more typical than open struggle. Rivalries certainly existed, and local politics could become vicious, but the gentry and nobility were not locked into a permanent war against each other. The idea that England followed a continental pattern, where older nobles were pushed aside and replaced by a new class buying office, does not fit the evidence very well. The gentry did grow in number during the 16th century, but this did not usually happen by wiping out noble power. Outside special cases, such as religious exclusion or families dying out without heirs, the nobility remained deeply present in both national and local government. Elizabeth's rule depended on a chain of service. At the top, great nobles and leading counselors shaped policy and commanded the Queen's confidence. Below them, gentry leaders enforced law, managed local administration, and supplied the practical muscle of government. In war, the same elite provided leadership, raising men, organizing defense, and carrying campaigns abroad when required. The crown leaned on this social order because it had no easy substitute. In return, nobles and gentry gained honor, authority, and a sense of identity built around loyalty and public duty. That exchange created a political stability strong enough to survive external threats, economic stress, and even moments of internal rebellion. For generations, people in England had repeated the comforting idea that poverty would never disappear. By Elizabeth's time, that old saying no longer felt comforting. The poor were everywhere, and many communities began to treat them as a growing danger rather than a familiar part of life. What made the situation feel new was not only the size of the problem, but the way it looked. Earlier thinking had relied on a simple moral map. On one side stood those who could not work because they were too old, sick, injured, or very young, people who were seen as rightful targets of help. On the other side stood the healthy wanderer who refused work, the person blamed for choosing idleness and living off begging or petty crime. That tidy division started to collapse as towns and villages encountered a different figure in large numbers. Men and women who wanted to work, and often did work, yet still could not secure steady wages enough to keep a household alive. Irregular employment, low pay, and sudden economic shocks created a new kind of hardship that did not fit the old labels. Officials were forced to admit that misery could come from the structure of the economy as much as from personal vice, even if they still described everything in moral language. Urban leaders tried to measure the problem with lists and counts, expecting to uncover swarms of tricksters who had drifted in from elsewhere to prey on charitable towns. Popular stories encouraged this suspicion, painting beggars as actors skilled in disguise and deception. But the record-keeping often revealed something more unsettling. Many of the struggling people were not strangers at all. They were local workers, especially in places tied to cloth-making and related trades, who found that jobs vanished, wages fell, or work appeared only in short bursts. Population growth pushed up demand for food, prices climbed, and households that once balanced their budgets suddenly could not. Bad harvests hit hardest because bread took priority over everything else, and when food ate up most income, spending on other goods dropped. That cycle damaged trades and reduced employment further. In this climate, poverty stopped being merely a stage that families passed through during childhood, early marriage, sickness, or old age. It began to look permanent for many wage earners. Children could be born into want, grow up in it, and never escape it. The poor were becoming an identifiable social layer rather than a temporary condition that might visit almost anyone. The response that took shape over decades aimed to manage three groups at once. Those who truly could not work were to be supported, usually by small regular payments or basic supplies organized locally. This was not framed as generous comfort, but as a last safety net, used only after checking whether close relatives could help first. At the same time, roaming beggars and people branded as habitual troublemakers were treated as threats to order. They were driven out, punished, and pushed from one boundary to the next. In practice, communities often preferred to move such people along rather than argue about where they truly belonged. But the whole system was built to make wandering costly and humiliating. The hardest puzzle remained the working poor, families who hovered near collapse because employment was unreliable or wages too thin. Authorities tried to force the ideal of work into daily life by creating make-work schemes, providing raw materials for spinning or other simple tasks that could be done at home, then attempting to sell the product to fund the next round. These plans often failed financially, yet they carried a symbolic message. Poverty should be answered with labor, whenever labor was possible. Children became a major target of policy. Officials saw large families as one of the main pressures dragging households into debt, and they treated the removal of children into service as both rescue and discipline. Poor children could be sent out at a very young age to live in another household, learning work and reducing the burden on their parents. On paper, this was presented as training and mercy. In reality, it also strengthened control over the poorest families and reshaped childhood into a tool of social management. Relief and coercion were not separate tracks. They ran side by side. Help for the weak came with surveillance and conditions, while punishment waited for anyone judged idle or disorderly. Behind all this stood a moral worldview that explained economic pain through character, sin, and social responsibility rather than through impersonal forces. Rising prices were often blamed on greed. Short harvests were interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. Poverty was regularly described as the fruit of laziness, even when the evidence pointed to unstable work and falling wages. The language of duty and discipline fit a society that imagined itself as one body, where disorderly limbs had to be corrected for the health of the whole. In that picture, some poor people were seen as sick members who needed care, while others were treated like infection to be cut away. The religious climate also hardened attitudes. Traditional charity had once been tied to older spiritual habits and communal institutions that offered aid. After those supports weakened or disappeared, local civil structures stepped into the gap. At the same time, a stricter reading of work and worth helped justify refusing aid to those labeled idle. Helping the poor became more selective, more controlled, and more tied to the idea that assistance must reshape behavior. By the 1590s, pressure reached a peak. A run of bad harvests, war costs, and fear of unrest created panic at the center and desperation at the bottom. Authorities pushed local leaders to enforce rules aggressively, keep order, and prevent hunger from turning into revolt. Religious leaders promoted fasting and giving, urging households to share what they could by cutting their own meals and handing food to known neighbors in need. For a short time, that kind of shared sacrifice helped some communities, but repeated failure exhausted goodwill. When crisis returned again and again, voluntary generosity could not carry the weight. The solution moved toward compulsion, regular assessments, mandatory contributions from property holders, and a more organized local system for collecting and distributing support. Step by step, without a single dramatic invention, Elizabethan England built an early welfare structure that mixed care with control and left behind detailed records. Those records were not meant to tell the poor their story, yet they still reveal, in sharp glimpses, how people at the edge of survival worked, begged, borrowed, endured, and tried to stay afloat in a world that was changing faster than old categories could explain. The laws introduced in Elizabethan England to deal with poverty did not work in the same way everywhere. In some places, they were applied carefully and consistently, while in others they barely functioned at all. What happened depended largely on how seriously local officials took their responsibilities and how willing communities were to cooperate. Yet one striking feature stands out. Long before the state tried to enforce a national system, many towns and parishes had already begun experimenting with their own ways of supporting and controlling the poor. These early efforts appeared decades before the most famous poor laws were fully established. By the middle of the 16th century, several large towns were already collecting money to support those in need. Cities like Norwich and York had systems in place by 1550, followed soon after by Exeter, Ipswich, Colchester, and others. Over the following decades, more towns adopted similar practices. Rural areas, however, lagged behind. Outside the towns, relief was uneven, informal, and often poorly recorded. One of the main difficulties for historians is that parish records from the countryside were rarely systematic. Notes about money given to the poor were often scribbled into the margins of church expense lists, making it hard to tell how organized the system really was. Another complication lies in language. Parish officials commonly used the word collection, but its meaning changed over time. At first, it referred simply to voluntary donations encouraged by the church. Only gradually did it come to mean a regular payment expected from parishioners. By the late 17th century, the same word could even describe the money received by the poor themselves. In the 16th century, however, the term could mean many different things, which makes it difficult to know exactly how structured these early systems were. Even so, surviving records suggest that some form of organized support existed in many villages earlier than once thought. From Suffolk to Essex, from Kent to Bedfordshire, parishes were raising money in various ways. Sometimes contributions were voluntary, sometimes pressured, and sometimes clearly enforced. Church wardens and collectors often blurred the line between money raised at church services and funds gathered through assessments. This confusion was hardly accidental. Churches had long maintained poor boxes where donations were placed and distributed at the discretion of local officials. These older practices continued well into Elizabeth's reign, even after laws introduced compulsory contributions. What this reveals is not a single system, but many. In some places, money was gathered weekly, in others quarterly or annually. Some parishes relied on semi-voluntary giving, while others moved early toward fixed rates. The most convincing evidence for early organized relief comes from areas where active magistrates pushed the system forward. In parts of southern and eastern England, detailed lists survive showing who paid into the system and who received support. Elsewhere, silence in the records suggests either poor administration or the loss of documents. Overall, it appears that regular, rate-based relief spread slowly and unevenly, reaching much of the Midlands and the North only in the early 17th century. Other parts of the poor law system worked far less well. Dealing with vagrants was especially difficult. Officials struggled to define who counted as a vagrant and where such people should be sent. Many of those targeted by the law were not criminals at all, but workers moving from place to place in search of employment. Some brought valuable skills and were quietly absorbed into local economies. Parish officers often chose not to punish mobility itself, intervening only when serious crimes occurred. As a result, most wanderers were neither jailed nor expelled. They were given a little food or money and encouraged to move on. Only a small number, usually those convicted of serious theft, faced harsh punishment. Even when the law was followed properly, with vagrants escorted between parishes using official documents, forged papers were common. There was an active trade in counterfeit permits, produced by people who knew the system well enough to exploit it. Attempts to provide work for the poor were even less successful. Small-scale efforts sometimes worked, especially when tools were given to individuals, such as spinning equipment for widows. But larger schemes usually failed. Poor management, theft, and low-quality goods meant that these projects often cost more than they produced. Parish officials soon realized it was cheaper and more effective to provide small cash payments instead. One area where officials invested more energy was the apprenticeship of poor children. By paying a modest sum, overseers could persuade households to take in and train a child. This was seen as a long-term saving. Many of these children were not orphans, and parents were often pressured into agreeing. If they resisted, their own support could be withdrawn. Despite claims of good intentions, this system did little to improve skills. Boys performed hard manual labor, while girls were confined to exhausting domestic work. In effect, the children of the poor were prepared for lives much like those they had already known. So what impact did all this have on everyday poverty? For some groups, especially the elderly, conditions improved. Parish records show regular payments to widows and older people, often supplemented with food, clothing, fuel, rent, medical care, and burial costs. This required close supervision. Parish officers frequently visited the poor to assess their needs. In places where this system functioned well, it clearly saved lives. Regions without organized relief suffered far more during times of crisis. Yet parish support was never enough on its own. Weekly payments were small and could not sustain a household. Relief was designed only to supplement income from work, charity, family support, and access to common resources. Because of this, older traditions of mutual aid remained essential. Gifts from neighbors, bread distributions, and assistance from local elites were not outdated customs, but necessary additions to an inadequate system. Most people living in poverty were not officially supported at all. They survived through fragile combinations of work, charity, and shared resources. A single setback could push them into desperation. For those who did receive parish aid, there was also a heavy social cost. Accepting regular support marked a person as dependent and reinforced their lower status. Unlike earlier forms of charity, which involved face-to-face interaction within the community, parish relief was delivered privately and bureaucratically. Gratitude was expected, and support could be reduced or withdrawn if behavior fell short of local expectations. Parish officials held immense power. They decided who deserved help and under what conditions. Poverty relief became a tool not only for survival, but for discipline. Those who were seen as immoral or disruptive could be punished through the removal of aid. While officials were not allowed to let people starve, they exercised strong influence over how the poor lived their lives. In this way, the Elizabethan poor relief system offered protection, but only at the cost of control, surveillance, and submission. The system of poor relief created in Elizabethan England was an extraordinary political achievement for its time. No other country in Europe attempted anything so ambitious. While other states relied on scattered charity or temporary measures, England built a nationwide structure that required local communities to raise money and redistribute it to those in need. This system proved so durable that it survived with only minor changes, for more than 2 centuries, lasting until the early 19th century. Although the framework was established in the late 16th century, it spread gradually across the country. Where it took hold early, it quickly showed its potential. In these areas, relief could be humane, flexible, and responsive. Parish officials distributed small but regular sums of money, often adding food, fuel, or clothing when circumstances demanded it. Decisions were shaped by local knowledge, allowing aid to be directed where hardship was most visible. In this sense, the system could adapt itself closely to real human need. At the same time, it was never designed to replace self-support. Payments were deliberately modest. They were meant to assist, not sustain. Relief was rarely generous enough to allow a family to live entirely without work or other help. Officials also imposed expectations on those who received aid. Behavior, obedience, and reputation mattered. Those judged idle, disruptive, or morally suspect could be excluded altogether. The system offered care, but it also enforced discipline. It rewarded conformity and punished deviation. There is no contradiction in this dual character. Any organized welfare system must decide who qualifies and who does not. Resources are limited, and assistance cannot be unlimited. From the beginning, Elizabethan relief rested on the idea that help should be selective. In that sense, it represents one of the earliest historical examples of a structured welfare state, complete with boundaries, conditions, and exclusions. One outcome, however, may seem unexpected. Rather than eliminating older forms of charity and mutual support, parish relief existed alongside them. Because official aid was only a supplement, traditional practices remained essential. Families helped one another. Neighbors shared food and fuel. Wealthier households continued to give alms. Parish relief did not replace these networks, but became woven into them. Only a small number of people ever received regular parish support. Those on relief formed a narrow inner group, surrounded by a much larger population living permanently on the edge of poverty. These people survived through fragile combinations of work, borrowing, favors, and informal charity. For them, official relief was often a last resort rather than a normal condition. As a result, the everyday experience of poverty is only partially visible in parish records. The neat lists of payments conceal lives shaped by uncertainty and improvisation. Small coins accumulated into weekly allowances. Occasional payments covered fuel, care, or illness. Eventually, the records ended with funeral expenses. Only rarely do individual lives break through this accounting language, usually when someone appealed directly to a local authority. When they did speak, the poor described lives marked by effort and endurance. They explained how they had delayed dependence for as long as possible. They spoke of borrowing household goods, negotiating unpaid rent, gathering wood, and relying on the goodwill of others. These accounts reveal the many ways people survived without formal support. Without the existence of parish relief and the paperwork it produced, these stories would likely have vanished entirely. In explaining their struggles, these individuals gave voice not only to themselves, but to countless others. They represented those who worked until age or illness made independence impossible, as well as generations who lived and died before any formal system existed. Ironically, the very machinery designed to manage poverty ended up preserving the memory of older traditions of mutual aid. By administering relief, parish officials unintentionally recorded the social practices that had sustained the poor long before the state stepped in. In the late 16th century, many adults in England were convinced that something had gone deeply wrong with the young. Writers, preachers, and moral commentators complained endlessly that young people no longer listened, showed respect, or followed guidance. They were portrayed as restless, defiant, and dangerously independent. This was not simply exaggeration or moral panic. During this period, English society began to think about youth in new and more urgent ways. England itself was young. The Protestant settlement was still fragile. The Queen was unmarried, the future uncertain, and the nation unsure of its direction. In this anxious atmosphere, youth became both a symbol and a problem. Like the country, young people were seen as unstable, impulsive, and unfinished. Supporters of reform worried that the next generation might fail to uphold the religious and moral order they were trying to build. At the same time, opponents feared that young minds might drift back toward older beliefs. Youth stood at the center of this tension. Despite the constant complaints, youth was not viewed only as a threat. It was also seen as a moment of possibility. Many believed that this stage of life was when character was formed and futures decided. Youth could slide toward disorder, but it could also be shaped into discipline and virtue. This belief drove a growing determination to intervene early, to guide, restrain, and train before habits hardened. Youth was understood as a long and volatile phase. It began when children left home or entered puberty and continued until marriage or the establishment of an independent household. During these years, young people were neither children nor full adults. They occupied an uncomfortable in-between state. Moral writers described this phase using images of boiling pots, untamed animals, and reckless motion. Youth was noisy, heated, excessive, and difficult to control. At the same time, it was believed to be the most teachable age. Young people were thought to be flexible, impressionable, and responsive. If discipline was applied early enough, they could be shaped in the right direction. If not, the opportunity would be lost. Once someone sank into vice or idleness, reform was believed to be nearly impossible. This urgency grew as it became harder for young people to achieve full adulthood. Marriage, property, and independence were increasingly out of reach. Economic pressures weighed heavily. Prices rose, land became scarce, and secure employment was harder to find. Many young men and women found themselves stuck, unable to move forward in life. They were legally adults but socially incomplete. Households were under strain. Apprenticeships and service arrangements were unstable, with frequent movement in and out. Jobs were short-term, wages low, and security rare. Young people moved constantly in search of work, drifting between towns and villages. Some found opportunities. Many did not. This mobility fed fears of disorder and criminality. Authorities became especially anxious about young women living independently. Women working from home, selling goods, or moving freely through towns challenged traditional expectations. Officials increasingly linked female independence with immorality. From the late 16th century onward, towns across England began cracking down on single women living outside service. Prosecutions multiplied, and informal work was pushed into illegality. Young men faced similar frustrations. Many completed apprenticeships only to discover that becoming a master was financially impossible. The costs of setting up a business were far beyond their reach. Without land, capital, or marriage prospects, they remained wage workers for years, sometimes decades. This prolonged dependence bred resentment. Some accepted it, others did not. For those trapped in this suspended state, life felt like standing still while time moved on. A few rebelled openly, others simmered quietly. Economic conditions, population growth, and shrinking opportunities combined to create a generation struggling to find a place. These realities fed a powerful belief that youth needed firm control. Service and apprenticeship were seen as solutions. Keeping young people under authority promised stability. Work would be done, crime reduced, families regulated, and the future secured. Whether realistic or not, this vision shaped policy. Laws were introduced to force youth into structured roles. Unmarried women were required to enter service. Boys were bound to long apprenticeships that delayed independence. Youth was no longer a flexible phase, but a regulated path. To lack regular work was no longer just unfortunate. It became suspicious. This was reinforced through preaching, instruction, punishment, and popular literature. Young offenders were publicly disciplined as warnings to others. Moral stories traced the path from idleness to execution. The message was clear. Early choices determined everything. Behind these efforts lay fear. England faced rising poverty, unrest, disease, and war. Young people were often seen at the center of riots and disorder. Reformers believed that if youth could be controlled, society itself could be saved. In Elizabethan England, growing up was not imagined as a smooth, natural journey. Adulthood had to be earned, and the path was tightly linked to work, discipline, and living under authority. For men especially, being considered fully grown meant more than age. It meant holding steady employment, leading a household, and proving reliability. Older people dominated the social hierarchy, and the young were expected to stay in their place. Respect was not treated as a private family matter, but as the foundation of public order. This unequal status was constantly reinforced through everyday customs and public signals. Communities used visible reminders to show who belonged where. Young people could be singled out in churches with special seating, watched more closely in public spaces, and made into examples when they crossed the line. Obedience was taught as a moral duty, and the idea of authority was stretched far beyond parents. A ruler, a mayor, a master, and even local officers were treated as paternal figures whose word carried the weight of command. Moral instruction also reached into private behavior. Young people were warned not only about stealing or violence, but about desire, vanity, and temptation. Adults worried about what the young read, how they dressed, how they danced, where they went at night, and what kinds of relationships they formed. Sermons and lessons constantly repeated the same themes: self-control, modesty, and submission. Yet real life was never as tidy as the ideal. Some youths mocked sermons, argued back during religious instruction, and treated moral lectures as a joke. The gap between what society demanded and what young people actually did was large, and everyone could feel it. In this world, social training was not automatic. Becoming respectable required effort, and reputation mattered. A person who was still called a boy was being pushed downward in status, regardless of age. People understood the rules, even when the rules were hard to follow. Girls were expected to learn the skills of household management and prepare for marriage. Boys were expected to learn a trade and build a future through structured work. For most, the decisive years began in the mid-teens, when they entered service or apprenticeship. For poorer children, it could start earlier, sometimes pushed by economic necessity and parish pressure. Apprenticeship and service were the main engines of this system. They were not just ways to learn work. They were tools for shaping character and controlling behavior. In towns, large numbers of boys were placed with masters, often close to home, but sometimes far away, especially in London. A major city drew young migrants from across the country. Smaller towns took fewer apprentices, but the pattern was similar everywhere. Youth was meant to be contained inside a household where authority could supervise daily life. Girls were far less likely to be recognized as having careers in the formal sense. Most apprentices were male, and in many places almost no girls appear in the official registers of skilled trades. Female work was often treated as invisible or informal, even though young women worked constantly. In poorer systems of training, including parish placements, girls could be bound out as well, partly because communities wanted to reduce the burden of supporting needy children. Inside households, the relationship between master and young worker was framed as both practical and moral. Young people were expected to avoid gambling, drinking, fighting, sexual misconduct, and public disorder. Some towns even tried to control hairstyles and clothing. In return, masters were expected to provide food, shelter, basic care, and reasonable correction when rules were broken. In theory, this arrangement created stability. In practice, it could produce serious vulnerability. Moving into a new household could be frightening. Many young people entered unfamiliar environments, sometimes in crowded towns full of disease, fire, accidents, crime, and sudden economic downturns. A busy city could offer excitement, but it also carried risks that were hard for a teenager to manage alone. Living spaces were often cramped. Servants and apprentices might sleep in crowded rooms with little privacy. That lack of space created constant tension and also created opportunities for abuse that could be difficult to prove or even to speak about. Some young women faced coercion or harassment from men who held power over them. Others found themselves blamed when pregnancies occurred, even when pressure or force played a role. Young men could also be targeted by predatory behavior from older figures in the household. Alongside sexual exploitation, physical cruelty appeared in many disputes. Some masters punished with extreme violence, far beyond what was considered acceptable. Others neglected young people, kept them in filthy conditions, withheld wages, or failed to provide proper food and care. These cases reached courts because someone outside the household stepped in. Neighbors spoke up, families intervened, or local officials investigated. The very existence of such records shows that households were not sealed worlds. They were watched, discussed, and sometimes challenged. Yet it would be misleading to portray household life only as abuse and misery. Many relationships were functional and even affectionate. Some young people remained with masters for years, built trust, and received support when they later tried to settle down. Gifts in wills and long-term loyalty sometimes reveal bonds that court records rarely show. Everyday life likely sat somewhere between harmony and conflict, filled with ordinary friction, jealousy, gossip, rivalries among young workers, resentment about unfair chores, and disputes over status inside the household itself. When conflict exploded, it could become dramatic. Some apprentices threatened masters, insulted them publicly, or turned household secrets into weapons. Running away was a persistent problem. Many youths vanished after a single crisis, while others fled repeatedly, chasing freedom, pleasure, or simply a different chance. Theft was another outlet. A household contained money, goods, and tools, and temptation was constant for young people who had little of their own. Some stole to survive, others to enjoy nightlife, clothes, drink, or sexual relationships. These behaviors reveal something important. Despite the strict rules imposed on them, many young people still carved out social lives. They met friends, went to alehouses, played games, visited entertainments, fell in love, and chose partners on their own terms, especially in towns where youth cultures were strong. Adult society often tolerated a certain level of youthful fun, so long as work was done and public order remained intact. But tolerance had limits, and those limits were shaped by gender. Young men were given more space to make mistakes. Young women faced harsher scrutiny because reputation was treated as fragile and morally decisive. Authorities cracked down hardest when they believed independent behavior threatened the household system itself. Another key point is that the ideal path to adulthood often failed. A large share of apprentices did not complete their terms. Some left early after learning basic skills. Some switched trades. Some were drawn into war, crime, or city opportunities that promised quicker money. Some died young. Others returned home rather than endure years of controlled labor. This meant that adulthood was frequently delayed, uneven, or incomplete. Many people reached their mid-20s without marriage, property, or stable status, drifting in a long waiting room between youth and full membership in adult society. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, England had become more confident as a Protestant political nation. But anxiety about youth had not eased. If anything, it sharpened. Economic pressure, population growth, and insecurity produced larger numbers of young people who could not find stable footholds. Moralists responded with louder warnings, painting youth as reckless and dangerous. Their complaints sound familiar because every age worries about the next generation. But in Elizabethan England, those fears were intensified by genuine structural changes. The social system was demanding tighter discipline at the very moment when economic reality made the standard route to adulthood harder to achieve. In that tension, the story of youth becomes a window into the wider age. It reveals a society trying to build order through households, labor training, and moral instruction, while a growing number of young people pushed back, slipped away, or simply failed to fit. The result was a world where growing up was not just a personal milestone, but a political concern, a moral battleground, and a daily struggle over authority, freedom, and survival. In the 20th century, historians argued fiercely about what life was really like for women in Elizabethan England, and they often reached opposite conclusions. Some saw the presence of a woman on the throne as a powerful signal that female authority could be real, visible, and legitimate. Others insisted that Elizabeth's rule actually highlighted the limits placed on women because she had to constantly manage expectations about gender, project strength in carefully chosen ways, and avoid marriage so no man could claim power over her. Even religion became part of the debate. One group of scholars believed the Protestant settlement encouraged a more companionable model of marriage that slowly improved women's status. Another group argued the reverse, that Protestant teaching reinforced the authority of husbands and fathers and tightened control over wives and daughters. Literature produced the same confusion. Some readers pointed to dramatic stories as proof that women were given stronger roles and greater respect, while others said those roles still sat inside strict stereotypes and were performed by boys, not women, which itself underlined how restricted female public presence remained. These clashes can feel baffling today, but they also reveal something important about the evidence. Much of what survives was written, filtered, recorded, judged, or preserved through male perspectives. Advice manuals describing the ideal woman can make it seem as if most women were quiet, modest, and obedient because that is what the manuals demanded. Court records, on the other hand, can create the opposite impression because courts mostly captured conflict, accusations of sexual misconduct, arguments, disobedience, scandal, and disorder. The documents do not simply mirror reality, they highlight different slices of it. Differences among historians also reflect different questions. Earlier scholarship often focused on inequality and emphasized women's legal limits, economic vulnerability, and exposure to violence. More recent work has been drawn to women's choices and tactics, showing how some women negotiated constraints, protected their interests, built support networks, or found room to act independently even inside a patriarchal culture. Many of these contradictions exist because the age itself was full of tension. It was a time when society was changing in noticeable ways without fully breaking from older structures. Population growth, shifting markets, religious conflict, rising use of law courts, new consumer habits, and changing styles of living did not begin the moment Elizabeth became queen, and they did not end when she died. Her reign was not a clean dividing line, but it did sit inside a long period when old expectations and new pressures rubbed against each other. That mixture created winners and losers. Some women benefited from new opportunities, others were squeezed harder, and many experienced little change at all. One way to understand this complexity is to look closely at a single life. Consider a woman who lived through almost the entire Elizabethan era and slightly beyond it, reaching old age in the early 17th century. She came from a prosperous urban family and married into the world of London trade. Through marriage, she gained social standing, but her identity still depended heavily on family connections, reputation, and household roles. Over time, she and her husband built serious wealth through commerce and property, and she became closely involved in business activity rather than remaining a silent figure in the background. When her husband died, she did not disappear into passivity. She managed assets for decades, made decisions that shaped the family's future, and helped place her children securely among the country gentry. In a world that publicly praised female obedience, widowhood could sometimes open a different kind of power: authority over property, control of household decisions, and the ability to negotiate marriage and inheritance from a stronger position. Her story also shows that female independence was not always romantic or abstract. It could be practical, calculating, and tied to money. Women in certain trades handled goods, negotiated transactions, supervised apprentices, managed property, and lent money through arrangements that could hide what was really happening. Even when law and custom limited women, daily economic life often created loopholes, workarounds, and informal spaces where skill and experience mattered. At one point, this woman came close to remarrying a wealthy man with status, but she refused when she realized he was more interested in improving his own position than valuing her as a partner. That refusal is revealing. It shows a woman weighing risk, reading character, and choosing autonomy over a deal that felt unsafe or disrespectful. At the same time, her life was not typical. Most women did not control large assets or leave such visible traces behind. Yet her experience helps illustrate the wider world women lived in, a society where men usually held the upper hand, but where power did not flow from one single rule. Instead, gender expectations were built from many sources at once: religious teaching, law, medical assumptions about bodies, everyday custom, jokes and sayings, and long-standing social habits. Taken together, these ideas made male authority feel natural and unquestionable. But because the sources were so mixed, they also produced blurred edges and contradictions. Women were sometimes described as spiritually equal, yet socially subordinate. They were expected to obey husbands, yet also expected to run households efficiently, direct servants, raise children, and keep family life stable. In practice, that meant many women exercised real authority inside the home, even while being told they were dependent. Elizabethan society also cared deeply about hierarchy, not only between men and women, but between all ranks. Almost everyone was expected to submit to someone above them. That meant the language of obedience applied broadly, shaping political loyalty as much as household order. Still, economic and social change put strain on these ideals. As markets expanded and some merchants and farmers grew richer, money could disrupt older assumptions about status based on land and birth. Families could rise, some could fall. That created anxiety, and one response was louder talk about proper rank and proper behavior, including attempts to regulate clothing and display. This anxiety also fed a growing obsession with order inside households. Authorities worried about young people living away from parents, about mobility, and about people who seemed to live without supervision. Laws and official sermons promoted obedience, yet riots, sharp protests over food prices, and outbreaks of disorder showed how limited such messages could be. Gender fears were part of the same mood. In the later decades of the reign, accusations of sexual wrongdoing increased in church courts, and women appeared frequently among the accused. Print culture amplified the noise. Cheap ballads, pamphlets, and sensational stories circulated vivid images of bad women, the unruly wife, the dangerous widow, the scandalous mother, the female criminal. Often the real target was not only women, but also men, because a man's honor depended on controlling his household. Public humor repeatedly punished the husband who failed to govern his wife, as if household disorder threatened society itself. Some historians have described this as a crisis in gender relations. That may be too dramatic as a label, because arguments over female behavior and male authority were ongoing and long-lived. But it is fair to say that worry about women's independence and sexuality became louder and more intense under Elizabeth. It appeared not only in talk and writing, but in rules designed to place single and widowed women under someone's authority, especially among the poorer classes. Officials feared the woman who lived on her own terms, worked independently, or moved without supervision. The ideal, in their eyes, was a woman governed by a husband, and if there was no husband, then a master. At the same time, women were not merely the objects of these debates. They participated in the culture that carried them. Some women wrote and translated. More learned to read and write, especially in cities. Women listened to public reading, heard sermons, attended performances, and discussed what they heard. The spread of print did not just reflect society. It helped shape it, carrying ideas farther, keeping them alive longer, and making them part of everyday conversation in homes, churches, and alehouses. So the Elizabethan world offers no single, simple verdict on women's lives. It was an age of strong constraints and real opportunities, depending on class, location, marital status, and personal circumstance. Many women lived under firm male authority. Some negotiated that authority skillfully. A few, through wealth, widowhood, or trade, gained striking control over their own decisions. The evidence can point in opposite directions because the reality itself was uneven, shifting, and full of contradictions, and that is exactly why the period still fuels debate. In Elizabethan England, patriarchal power was not only an attitude or a sermon topic. It was built into the legal system and into everyday expectations about who mattered, who decided, and who owned what. Stories and plays can be read in different ways, but law leaves a colder footprint. The rules of marriage, property, inheritance, and public authority pushed women into dependence as a default setting, even when real life often forced people to bend those rules in practice. Marriage was the clearest legal turning point. A single woman could hold property, make agreements, and take action to protect her interests. But once she married, her identity was largely folded into her husband's. Land, savings, household goods, and the income produced by property were treated as if they belonged to him, or at least were under his control. This was not just symbolic. It shaped the balance of power inside the home. It also shaped what happened when a marriage turned sour because the husband's authority was backed by custom and by the assumption that he stood above his wife in the household hierarchy. Inheritance rules reinforced the same direction of travel. Families often prioritized sons, and wealth was steered toward male lines. Over time, this mattered enormously. If money and land repeatedly flowed away from women at marriage and at death, then widowhood could become a dangerous cliff edge. Some widows had a legal claim to support from their late husband's estate, but the quality of that protection varied, and many women still faced insecurity once the household's main male owner was gone. In that sense, law did not merely describe patriarchy. It helped manufacture it, generation after generation. At the same time, it would be a mistake to imagine women as legally erased. The system limited them, but it did not turn them into ghosts. Widows and single women could and did use the law, and even married women found ways to act through family agreements, trusted intermediaries, and everyday assumptions that a wife could manage tasks as part of her husband's household enterprise. In major towns, certain customs even allowed some working wives to operate in business as if they were independent, especially when their trade was well established and socially accepted. One of the most striking features of late 16th century England was how intensely litigious society became. Courts grew busy, and disputes over debts, property, inheritance, insults, promises, and broken obligations multiplied. In that crowded legal world, women appear in surprising numbers. They sued for financial security after a husband's death, fought over family property, defended themselves in debt actions, and brought reputational conflicts into formal settings. In church courts, where marital legal covering mattered less, women show up even more, especially in quarrels that turned on honor and public speech. Whatever the moral language of the age claimed, many women were not silent figures. They were active participants in conflict, negotiation, and public assertion. This legal energy did not necessarily create social harmony. When many people are suing each other, it can signal a society that feels unstable, pressured, and anxious about boundaries. Yet it also created opportunities. If you knew how to navigate the system, or had kin who could help, you could defend yourself, push back, and sometimes even win against someone with higher status. For some women, courtrooms became one of the few public arenas where speech and argument could carry weight. Work and the economy tell a similar story of limits mixed with necessity. Ideals often claimed that men belonged out in the world, while women belonged at home. In reality, most households could not function on ideals. Women worked constantly in fields and gardens, in dairies and kitchens, in brewing and baking, in spinning and sewing, in nursing and childcare, in lodging and retail, and in countless forms of casual exchange that kept families afloat. Still, recognition and pay were usually unequal. Men were more likely to be named by a trade in records, while women were often defined by marital status, as if their main identity was relational rather than professional. Women also faced sharper barriers to formal training. Apprenticeship structures and guild protections leaned heavily male, especially in high-status or highly specialized crafts. Even when women became skilled, they could be pushed aside as trades professionalized and scaled up. Fields that began as home-centered or female-dominated could shift toward male control once profits rose, regulation tightened, and organized interests took over. In that sense, economic growth could cut both ways. It opened markets and credit networks, but it also rewarded specialization and institutional power, which tended to favor men. Religion added another layer of complexity. Faith was a pillar of patriarchal teaching, constantly repeating themes of obedience, modesty, and order. Yet religion also gave many women purpose, voice, and a sense of authority inside the household. Women taught children, influenced servants, shaped family habits, and judged neighbors by moral standards. Piety could be a kind of social power, and spiritual seriousness could grant respect even to those without wealth. Reform also introduced sharper choices, and choice creates friction. When family members did not share the same beliefs, the household could become a battleground of loyalty, conformity, and conscience. For authorities, women's religious choices could be especially hard to police. A married woman's legal dependency could become a shield as well as a cage. If she owned nothing in law, how could fines be collected from her? If her husband was forced to pay, was he being punished for another person's conscience? If prison was used, was that fair when the legal structure itself made payment impossible? These puzzles reveal something important. Patriarchal systems can look confident on paper while still struggling to manage the messy reality of belief and behavior. Politics followed a similar pattern. Women were excluded from formal offices and voting. But power is not only what happens in parliaments and courts. Power also lives in access, influence, persuasion, and social networks. Elite women could shape decisions through patronage, gatekeeping, information flow, marriage arrangements, hospitality, and relationship building. In towns and villages, women influenced local life through reputation, community surveillance, moral enforcement, and mutual support networks. They joined food protests, reacted to enclosure pressures, and defended family standing in public disputes. They were not outside society's power struggles. They were embedded in them, even if the official system insisted they were merely peripheral. None of this turns Elizabethan England into a story of straightforward progress. Patriarchal ideology remained strong, and most women's power was conditional. It was often temporary, borrowed, tied to widowhood, dependent on kin, or limited to specific spaces like household management and local community life. A woman might act boldly, argue fiercely, and run complex affairs, yet still be treated as an exception rather than proof that the rules should change. That tension is the heart of the period. The law could be harsh in principle, flexible in practice, and unforgiving when relationships broke down. Economic change could widen the world while narrowing women's formal opportunities. Religion could enforce obedience while offering meaning and moral standing. social life could demand female submission while relying on female labor, judgment, and resilience. So the most honest conclusion is not that women were powerless, and not that they were free, but that the system was designed to keep authority male while everyday life repeatedly forced women to act, adapt, and sometimes push beyond the lines drawn for them. The result was a society where women's agency was real, often visible, sometimes impressive, yet rarely allowed to become the foundation for a new order. In late Tudor England, people did not imagine society as a collection of isolated individuals. They pictured it as a chain of households. If you wanted to understand how the realm worked, you began at the hearth, not at the parliament bench. The household was treated as the first training ground for order, the place where authority was learned, tested, and enforced long before it appeared in the wider world. To a modern eye, family sounds private and emotional. In Elizabethan thinking, it was public, structural, and deeply political. The household was expected to run like a small state. It had ranks, rules, duties, and punishments. Harmony inside the home was not just a personal goal, it was presented as the foundation of peace outside it. If homes collapsed into quarrels and disobedience, many believed the kingdom would follow. That is also why a household was defined broadly. It was not simply husband, wife, and children. It included servants and apprentices, and it was tied to property, tools, and livestock. The home was a workplace as much as a living space, a unit that produced goods, earned income, stored resources, and consumed supplies. Daily life was economics, managing food, fuel, clothing, wages, debts, and the labor of everyone under one roof. In that setting, relationships were shaped not only by affection, but by responsibility and survival. Because life expectancy was fragile, many homes were rebuilt more than once. Death could rearrange a family faster than choice ever could. Remarriage was common, step relations multiplied, and children often grew up under a mix of parents, step-parents, and substitute guardians. The ideal image was stable, but the real experience could be fluid and unpredictable. That constant rebuilding did not make family bonds weak, but it did make them complex. When historians argue over whether early modern families were warm or harsh, part of the problem is evidence. People rarely wrote down their feelings the way modern diaries and letters might suggest. What survives often comes from the well-off, and it is easier to find rules and disputes than quiet affection. If you look at advice literature, you find stern instruction about obedience. If you look at courts, you find conflict and scandal. Neither source alone describes everyday life. What they show is the pressure people felt to keep households functioning and the anxiety that disorder could spread. At the center of the household stood hierarchy. The common ideal placed the husband as head, the wife as deputy, children as learners, and servants as subordinates. Yet this hierarchy was never just brute command. Moral teaching repeatedly insisted that authority carried obligations. The head of household was expected to provide, to guide, to correct without turning into a tyrant, and to maintain a stable peace that kept work and reputation intact. If he ruled with uncontrolled anger, he was said to invite rebellion rather than loyalty. Marriage, in this world, was imagined as both unequal and cooperative. A wife was expected to obey, yet she was also expected to manage. She ran the interior economy: food, clothing, cleanliness, storage, preparation, care of the young, supervision of servants, and the rhythm of daily labor. Many homes could not function without that authority. So while the language of the time stressed female submission, practice often required female command, especially over younger people and servants. Parenthood was also shared, but divided by custom. Mothers were associated with early childhood care and the intimate work of nurturing. Fathers were associated with later training, discipline, and decisions about schooling, placements, and work. Both roles were framed as moral duties, not private preferences. A child was not simply to be loved, but to be shaped. The household was expected to form character, teach manners, and prepare the young for adult roles. This emphasis on training becomes even clearer when you look at service and apprenticeship. Large numbers of teenagers left home to live under another roof. That move was not treated as a strange modern phenomenon. It was a normal stage of growing up. Service placed young people under discipline and put them into a routine of labor, prayer, and supervision. Masters and mistresses were expected to act as substitute parents, teaching skills and controlling behavior at the same time. Youth, in the imagination of the period, was risky. Many believed the young were naturally drawn toward disorder and temptation. Some explained this through religion. The heart was inclined toward wrongdoing and needed correction. Others explained it through medicine. Young bodies were thought to be hot, restless, and impulsive, and therefore more likely to chase pleasure and ignore limits. Whatever the explanation, the solution was similar: strict guidance, regular work, and punishment when necessary. Discipline was accepted as a normal tool of household government. The famous warning about the rod reflects a common belief that firmness prevented future ruin. But the same culture also feared domestic tyranny. Advice often urged household rulers to correct without cruelty. The goal was not just obedience, it was stability. A home where labor was done, resources were guarded, reputations were protected, and younger people learned the habits that would later keep the wider community orderly. Even with all this, the household was not a simple pyramid. Power could overlap and clash. Wives might be subordinate to husbands, yet superior to servants. Mothers might command children while still being commanded by a spouse. A respected mistress could issue orders to male servants, while still being expected to show deference to her husband. Age, marital status, and gender created layered authority, and that made household life a constant negotiation between command and cooperation. So the Elizabethan household was not merely a private place where people ate and slept. It was imagined as a miniature commonwealth, a training school for obedience, and a working business that had to be managed. It formed character, controlled youth, organized labor, and taught people how to live inside a hierarchy. And because so much of national stability was believed to rest on what happened under a roof, the household became one of the most moralized, supervised, and anxiously discussed institutions of the age. Homes in Elizabethan England were always in motion. People talked about the household as if it were a neat little unit, ruled by a married couple with children and a servant or two. In reality, that tidy picture was often more wish than fact. Illness, death, remarriage, migration, and poverty kept tearing holes in the pattern. The constant preaching about order was partly a response to this instability. If life refused to stay still, then rules and ideals tried to pin it down. One of the most surprising things about these homes is how small they usually were. The popular image of huge, multi-generation families packed under one roof does not fit most English communities. The typical home often contained only 4 or 5 people. A couple might live with their children and perhaps a servant. And that was it. Grandparents, uncles, and cousins mattered as kin, but they usually did not sleep at the same hearth. When people married, the goal was commonly to set up a separate home of their own, not to fold into an extended clan household. That expectation shaped courtship and marriage in a very practical way. Marriage was not only a romantic decision, it was a decision to launch an independent working unit. A couple had to be able to feed themselves, pay rents, gather furniture and tools, and survive hard seasons. Because of this, weddings often came late. Many men married around their late 20s, and many women in their mid-20s. For a lot of people, adulthood felt delayed because real independence was tied to running a household, and that usually required time, training, and resources. The negotiation of marriage happened under watchful eyes. Parents, relatives, and neighbors all had stakes in whether a match would succeed or collapse. Among wealthy families, alliances and property mattered openly. But even among farmers, artisans, and laborers, the calculations were still there. A poor household could not afford a marriage that added mouths without adding skills or income. People looked at character, reputation, work habits, health, faith, and the ability to keep a home afloat. A marriage that seemed reckless could become a burden not just for the couple, but for the wider community that might later have to help them. This is also why service and apprenticeship mattered so much. Large numbers of young people left their birth homes for years at a time. They worked in other households, learned skills, and saved what little they could. For many, this was the only realistic route toward having enough to marry and establish a home. The experience could be long and exhausting, but it was treated as a normal stage of life. In farming regions, service taught the rhythms of land and animals. In towns, apprenticeship trained boys, and a smaller number of girls in crafts and trades. These paths were supposed to create disciplined adults with marketable abilities, and they also reduced the number of unmarried youths trying to survive on their own. Not everyone managed to marry. Some never gathered the resources. Some could not find a suitable partner. Others may have avoided marriage by choice, but that was harder to live out openly. Lifelong single people, especially those without means, were often pushed toward living with relatives or staying in service. Authorities disliked independent single living because it was associated with mobility, poverty, and disorder. In a world with a thin safety net, the fear of drifting, jobless people was constant. Even within marriage, families did not grow endlessly. Births were often spaced out, and breastfeeding commonly created long pauses between pregnancies. Many women still faced repeated pregnancies across their fertile years, but the pace could be slower than people imagine. On top of that, the shadow of death was always present. Child mortality was high, and disease could sweep through a household without warning. This meant family size was unpredictable. Some couples watched several children grow. Others lost infants and toddlers and carried grief that never appears cleanly in official records. Household size also depended less on the number of children than on the number of servants. At the top end, elite homes could contain many employees: cooks, gardeners, grooms, clerks, and helpers for every task. These were not family in a modern emotional sense, but they lived inside the household world and were part of its daily structure. At the bottom end, a home might be only a widow and a child, or a single adult renting a room, or two people joined by necessity rather than the ideal of a married couple raising children. Female-headed households were especially common where widowhood and male absence shaped life. A woman living alone, or with a child, or with a lodger, might be marginal in wealth, but still carried the authority and responsibility of household rule. She had to negotiate rent, work, credit, and reputation in a society that spoke constantly of male headship. The ideal remained loud, but the lived reality made room for many exceptions. Servants and apprentices filled in the gaps created by this restless demographic world. Most service was not a lifelong career. It was youth labor, traded for food, clothing, lodging, and small wages. In some places, poorer children were sent out earlier and stayed longer, and parish authorities sometimes placed very young children into service when families collapsed through poverty or death. The household, then, was not just a private home. It was a system for training the young, managing the vulnerable, and keeping a community from breaking apart. So when you picture the Elizabethan household, imagine something flexible rather than fixed. The ideal household was a symbol of stability, but the real household was constantly being rebuilt. Late marriages, long years of service, uneven wealth, high mortality, and local supervision all shaped who lived together and for how long. Underneath the moral speeches about order, daily life was a matter of adaptation, keeping a roof over heads, keeping work going, and trying to build a future in a world that regularly pulled families apart. Being young in Elizabethan England often did not mean staying in the same household. Children and adolescents moved constantly. There was a long period of learning and work that began in one family and continued in another. Some did this out of necessity, others in the hope of building a better life. A young woman might work in one house for a few months, then move to another nearby village, and then enter yet another household. Most of these journeys were not over great distances, but between neighboring villages. There was, however, one major exception: London. The city drew young people from across the country into service work, and sometimes absorbed a significant share of an entire generation, even if only temporarily. For many, London became a stop that changed the direction of life, if only for a short time. These movements usually took place through familiar ties. Relatives, neighbors, godparents, and family friends often stepped in to place a young person in a reliable household. Such connections could ease tensions because service relationships were not always peaceful. Stories of the time and urban gossip often portrayed servants and apprentices as sources of trouble. Young people were described as sleepy, lazy, thieving, disrespectful, or unruly, and employers were warned to be cautious of the stranger inside the house. Court records, too, contain cases of quarrels, insults, theft, staying out at night, and running away. Yet this was not the whole picture. Within the same household, the weight of daily life, shared meals, shared work, shared exhaustion, could sometimes create genuine bonds. Some employers gave the young people in their service a small sum of money, clothing, or help in arranging a good marriage. Some servants, even years later, remembered their former households with gratitude. At the same time, service had a darker side. Young people had very little privacy within the household, and the balance of power was often one-sided. Severe beatings, harsh punishments, humiliation, and especially the sexual pressure that young women could face were always possible dangers. It was easy to label a runaway servant as disrespectful, but sometimes escape was the only form of protection. In investigations into the pregnancies of young women, the fact that accusations often pointed towards the master of the house or those close to him reveals how deep this vulnerability ran. Of course, not every relationship was forced, but the reality of who held power explains why such situations were so heavy and complex. one of the main factors determining when young people entered service and how long they stayed was the everyday presence of death. Childbirth was dangerous, diseases spread quickly, and adults often died before seeing their children grow up. When a father or mother, the pillar of the household, died, the lives of the children could change overnight. Schooling might end, the household might shrink, income might tighten, and children would enter another household at an earlier age. Sometimes siblings were sent to different places, one to an artisan, another to a different line of work. Growing up, then, was not defined by age alone, but accelerated by harsh circumstances. High mortality also meant that households were frequently rebuilt. Widows and widowers, especially those with young children, often considered remarriage quickly. Running a household, cooking, cleaning, child care, production, selling, managing debts, was extremely difficult for one person alone. For this reason, widowers tended to remarry sooner, because the daily functioning of the household often depended on the unseen labor of a spouse. Women, by contrast, could be more cautious about remarriage, since a new marriage carried risks both for their children's future and for their own freedom of action. Some women sought support through remarriage. Others chose to preserve the relative independence that widowhood could bring. As a result, many households included step-parents, step-siblings, and half-siblings living together. Family became not only a matter of blood, but a newly constructed arrangement. In such a mobile world, the household was not simply a home, it was also a workplace. Most households produced and consumed primarily to survive. The goal was not large profits, but getting through the winter, managing debt, paying rent and taxes, and preparing a future for children. Some households could produce a small surplus to sell at market. Others became dependent on the market and even had to buy basic food. This difference also shaped a household's sense of independence. A self-sufficient household was seen as respectable, while one constantly dependent on outside help was considered fragile. The household economy rested on everyone's labor. Women did far more than raise children. Preparing and preserving food, cleaning, sewing, spinning, small-scale animal care, dairy work, and organizing goods for market were all central to keeping the household afloat. In some places, women were even the public face of the household at the market, since selling small goods, shopping, and maintaining exchange networks with neighbors were part of daily life. Men, too, were rarely limited to a single occupation and often turned to additional work at different times of the year. A household was not built on one job, but on a constantly adjusted balance of labor. Servants and apprentices were a crucial part of this system. In some households, work could not function without them. Long and heavy hours, often little reward, but in return shelter and the chance to learn. In towns, apprenticeships could be longer and more binding, meaning that some young people spent most of their childhood and youth not in their parents' homes, but in their master's household. At times, an apprentice could have a closer daily relationship than the employer's own children, because work, meals, and discipline followed a shared rhythm. Children's labor was not excluded either. At younger ages, they learned mostly by following adults around, but as they grew older, they carried water, gathered firewood, tended small animals, helped with the harvest, and looked after siblings, easing the household's burden. In poorer households, this contribution began earlier and was more visible. In some families, even the small earnings from children's piecework could be vital to survival. Above all of this hovered something invisible: reputation. Much of exchange was built on trust. people talked about who paid debts on time, whose goods were honest, and which households were orderly. A good name was not just a matter of pride. It meant credit, help, and the ability to survive in the market. Domestic conflict, drunkenness, wastefulness, or moral scandal could damage trust in the eyes of neighbors and harm the household economy. For this reason, many families struggled not only for money, but for respectability. Looking at rebellion, everyday crime, and public disorder is one of the quickest ways to understand what a society fears and how it tries to protect itself. That is why so many historians, especially those interested in ordinary people, politics, and the law, keep returning to court records and reports of unrest. Earlier scholars used these sources to bring back into view the men and women who rarely appear in official stories, and they treated riots as rare moments when the usual habits of obedience cracked and people's real needs and beliefs rose to the surface. Over time, researchers also realized that these same records reveal just as much about the powerful, because the line between crime, riot, and disorder was often drawn by lawmakers and judges. What officials called disorder could, from another angle, look like a tense negotiation or a local struggle over resources. So the focus shifted from simply describing the experience of one side to tracing how authority was built, felt, and resisted in daily encounters between rulers and the ruled. Because these questions stretch across long timelines, histories of disorder are often organized around big changes in population or the economy rather than the reign of a single monarch. And yet, Elizabeth's years deserve special attention, partly because they are so often painted as a calm golden age. On one level, it is true that England did not see the old medieval-style uprisings in these decades, and it avoided the large-scale religious civil wars tearing parts of Europe apart. The chaos associated with earlier Tudor rule had eased, and the later storms of the Stuart period had not fully arrived. By that measure, the country could look peaceful. But the same decades also produced striking levels of killing and harsh punishment. From around the 1580s, the criminal courts entered a long period of strain that would continue well past Elizabeth's death. People today may debate whether crime and rebellion belong on the same spectrum of social conflict, but many Elizabethans did not separate them so neatly. They saw small offenses as the beginning of bigger breakdowns, and they were far less relaxed about their world than later commentators who label it stable. Leading officials kept repeating one warning: ignore minor wrongdoing, and you will invite disaster. Senior figures who oversaw the legal system pressed local magistrates to enforce laws even against what might look like trivial misbehavior. The logic was simple. If you let small faults spread, they grow into serious crimes. Some of the most influential legal writers and officials urged juries and local communities to treat idleness, unlawful games, and petty theft as the roots of a wider moral and social decay. In that way of thinking, the road from a small act of disorder to a major crisis was not a mystery. It was a predictable slide unless someone stopped it early. So policing and punishment became more intense, not only through public violence by the state, but through constant local participation, because early modern law enforcement depended heavily on ordinary men who served as constables, jurors, and parish officers. What makes Elizabeth's reign especially revealing is the contrast between frequent criminal prosecution and the relative scarcity of open rebellion. That gap tells us something about how the state was taking shape. Many in the ruling class believed they shared enough interests and enemies with enough of the population to prevent large uprisings, even during economic hardship and religious tension. When desperation grew, the discontented often had few realistic paths besides crime, complaint, or reluctant compliance. We can see these patterns more clearly in Elizabeth's time, partly because more documentation survives. Serious criminal cases ultimately fell under the supervision of the central courts, but in practice, most major trials happened in the counties when traveling judges came on circuit. Local sessions also handled a wide range of cases, and over these decades, more of the gravest felonies shifted toward the higher-level county hearings. That did not reduce the workload of local magistrates for long, because they were quickly swamped by increasing numbers of smaller offenses. Extra-local hearings became more common as officials tried to manage the growing flow of cases. Towns and special jurisdictions ran their own courts as well, and in a few places their records help fill the gaps left by missing county material. Historians who have worked hardest with these sources also warn against treating court totals as perfect mirrors of real crime. A great deal of wrongdoing never entered the record at all, so rising numbers can reflect tougher enforcement and more reporting as much as they reflect more criminal behavior. Even with those limits, the broad picture is consistent. Property crimes made up the bulk of prosecuted felonies across the period, while killings were the next most common. Charges like rape, arson, or witchcraft appeared far less often, and women were prosecuted in noticeably smaller numbers than men. The most dramatic change, however, was the surge in felony prosecutions beginning around 1580 and continuing into the early decades of the next century, far beyond what population growth alone would explain. Executions rose along the same curve, peaking in the late 1590s, dipping briefly, then climbing sharply again in the 1620s before later falling away. Killings have drawn special attention because they are harder to conceal and more likely to be prosecuted with some consistency, which makes them a useful gauge of social strain. When researchers rebuilt the numbers more carefully, they found that the most intense rise in homicide came not in the early 1560s, but later, with the 1580s standing out as exceptionally violent by the standards of a long historical sweep. Even if England's homicide rates could look modest next to the extremes reported in some parts of Europe, the combination of higher prosecutions, higher conviction and execution proportions, and elevated killing rates hardly supports a simple story of a serene golden age. At the same time, pressure on the courts forced the system to adapt. Judges and officials looked for ways to process more defendants without collapsing under the load. Juries were asked to handle more cases at once, and informal deals became more common, encouraging people to admit guilt to lesser offenses in exchange for avoiding the harshest penalty. Alongside this, older legal mechanisms that offered a path away from execution were reshaped and used more widely. Mercy could be managed in a more organized way, with judges recommending certain prisoners for pardons after traveling through the counties. Conditional mercy, trading punishment for exile, transport, or service, also began to appear in more deliberate forms. These were not simply soft options. They were tools that allowed the state to punish more people, encourage more prosecutions, and keep the level of executions within limits that authorities could defend. Few figures were attacked more fiercely in public discussion than the vagrant, who was often portrayed by comfortable observers as the human symbol of danger. Laws aimed at controlling labor, suppressing idleness, and preventing desperation from exploding into unrest were strengthened, combining force with a developing system of relief. The message became clearer by the end of Elizabeth's reign. Not everyone without work was choosing it, and a society that relied only on the whip would eventually pay the price. institutions designed to discipline through labor spread to more counties in the late 16th century. These places blended punishment and support, and they became a key part of how authorities tried to manage petty wrongdoing before it became something larger. Behind all of this was a deep fear that small disturbances could ignite into mass violence. Officials often spoke as if the difference between a theft and an uprising was only a matter of scale. That fear encouraged harsh tools that sat uneasily with England's self-image, expanded use of extreme interrogation to extract information, broader use of emergency military-style discipline against the poor, and creative legal thinking that reclassified acts once treated as private harms into public threats. Powerful lawyers proved adept at persuading courts to treat certain forms of protest as dangers to the entire realm. Yet, for much of the reign, the nightmare of nationwide rebellion did not arrive. Riots happened, sometimes often, but many were limited and purposeful, more like collective pressure aimed at correcting local wrongs than an attempt to overturn the state. Crowds frequently framed their actions as defense of customary rights, especially in disputes over shared land and resources. People also learned to maneuver around legal definitions, keeping numbers small, dividing into pairs, and dispersing before the moment when the law could transform a protest into a hanging offense. Most participants wanted a result, not a revolution. The atmosphere changed in the 1580s and 1590s as harvest failure, high prices, unemployment, and the burdens of war pushed communities closer to the edge. Authorities tried a mix of responses: tighter control of food markets, pressure on landlords and employers to care for dependents, stronger poor relief, while also turning to severity. That severity sometimes fed the very anger it was meant to stop. In London, apprentices repeatedly clashed with officials, and a string of major disturbances showed how quickly punishment could become the spark. In the mid-1590s, the city saw a series of confrontations over basic goods and over the humiliations imposed by civic leaders under pressure from above. Crowds forced prices down by direct action, destroyed instruments of public shame, and gathered in large numbers. The state's answer was to treat some of this not as mischief, but as an attack on authority itself, and a handful of men paid with the most brutal sentences available. Hard years also produced frightening talk in the countryside. Food riots flared in several counties, and the familiar idea of protest as a reminder to rulers of their duty began to strain. Some people openly spoke of striking at the rich, of preferring death in public to starvation at home. In one notable episode, a small group tried to stir a rising, beginning with plans to tear down enclosures and seize grain, and then drifting toward the fantasy of marching to London to join urban unrest. In practical terms, the effort collapsed. Few turned up, and the would-be leaders were easily isolated. But in legal terms, it became something bigger. The men were treated as if they had aimed at war against the crown, and arguments in court helped redraw the boundary between riot and treason. After that, an attack tied to one local grievance might still be prosecuted as a riot, but broader action framed against enclosures in general could be cast as treasonous. The punishments that followed made the message unmistakable and set a precedent that later governments could use against future troublemakers. John Walter's point about that botched Oxfordshire plot is simple but powerful. Hardship does not automatically turn into rebellion. The suffering was real, the idea had been thought through, and yet nothing caught fire. Most people, even when angry, would not be the first to step over the line from resentment into open revolt. And that hesitation mattered. Elizabethan England lived through population pressure, religious upheaval, and in the later decades, an almost constant atmosphere of war and insecurity. Still, large popular uprisings were uncommon. There were plenty of riots, plenty of theft and violence, and lots of tense confrontations between neighbors and authorities, but very few moments when huge numbers tried to overthrow the order of things. A handful of men preached rebellion in market crowds or in alehouses, but most never built momentum. Officials often imagined roaming armies of vagrants or gangs of petty criminals joining forces to pull the state apart. Yet the feared explosion rarely arrived. In mid-November, they struck a dramatic note by storming into Durham Cathedral, wrecking the new communion setup, and holding a Catholic Mass. They presented themselves as defenders of true religion and the Commonwealth, claiming they were targeting the evil advisors around the Queen rather than the Queen herself. Thousands joined, though not everyone was accepted. The leaders turned away those who lacked weapons and sent many home to wait for another call. People joined for mixed reasons, some for pay, some through pressure, some because they believed in the cause. But the movement wrapped itself in religious symbolism. Old banners appeared, and the violence focused on the signs of Protestant change. Married ministers were driven out because marriage was read as a clear marker of the new religious identity. In villages, people who stayed behind and those who marched worked to reverse the religious reforms. Books were burned, older forms were restored, and services were held in the old style. Yet conviction did not equal competence. The rebels managed a few local successes, but much of their movement was confused and poorly directed. Loyalist officials hid behind walls, outnumbered and unsure how reliable their own men were. Then the balance shifted. A large royal force arrived from the south, and the leaders fled across the border, leaving their followers exposed. They hoped they could regroup with foreign support and a powerful religious endorsement, but nothing materialized beyond a brief flare-up led by an ally early the next year. Most of those who had taken up arms were left to face the Queen's anger. The crushing of the rising explains why England saw nothing quite like it again during Elizabeth's reign. The government moved with speed and calculation. Roughly hundreds were executed on the spot under emergency authority, with bodies deliberately left hanging as a public lesson. At the same time, the state made a cold distinction about who died immediately and who was saved for later. The poorest were used as the visible warning, while landholders were often kept for formal trials because treason convictions meant forfeited property. The Crown did not only punish, it profited. Confiscated estates and heavy fines flowed upward, giving the regime new resources to reward supporters, tighten control, and fund future enforcement. Some observers even noted openly that if handled correctly, the rebellion could strengthen the Queen's position. In practice, that is exactly what happened. Control was not built only with rope and fire. The Crown also shaped the story people were told about what rebellion meant. Sermons against disobedience were pushed across the country, hammering one central message: defying the monarch was defying God. The northern rebels were held up as a warning, portrayed as tied to foreign influence and dangerous religious enemies. Printed attacks poured out as well: songs, pamphlets, and angry moral lessons, insisting that harshness was the only safe response. The language of the time began to fuse certain identities with treason, turning political conflict into a moral divide. That kind of messaging mattered later. When unrest appeared again, many were quicker to suspect foreign plots or religious enemies than to believe that desperate poor people might rise on their own. It is telling that, in later scares, Some local gentry dismissed early warnings by assuming any trouble must be the work of hidden outsiders rather than their own hunger. So why was rebellion so rare in a world that produced so much grievance? One answer is that big uprisings usually needed both popular anger and elite leadership. Ordinary suffering could be deep, but without powerful patrons, money, networks, and a sense of legitimacy, most schemes never got beyond talk. That is why small-time agitators struggled to build a force, and why even a high-born plot like Essex's failed when the crowd refused to follow. Another answer is that national identity and external threats could pull people toward loyalty, especially when political conflict was framed as defense against foreign danger. And then there is Elizabeth herself. She avoided some confrontations that might have forced a direct clash, managed her public image with skill, and used the language of duty to keep the social fabric from tearing too openly. But the Northern Rising adds a sharper edge to the picture. The Crown did not rely only on persuasion. It relied on fear, on money, on confiscation, and on building a larger capacity to punish and reward. All of this also complicates the comforting myth of a calm golden age. England did not erupt into constant mass rebellion, but violence and punishment climbed, and many people answered hardship with theft, assault, and smaller forms of organized protest. Stability often meant something grim: more surveillance, more prosecutions, harsher examples, and a population that learned what rebellion could cost. Sometimes royal pressure worsened tensions. Sometimes it offered incentives that kept people obedient. Whether you see the period as a triumph of governance or a story of containment depends on where you stand. What it was not, for most people living through it, was a quiet age of order.